As we continue to progress through the Middle Ages, we find that the worship art is getting more interesting. And this happens for basically two reasons. One reason is that artists, by their very nature, will tend to want to make worship art more and more interesting. I can tell you this as an artist myself, and having worked with artists for several years now, that this is just our tendency. And it's not a bad tendency in and of itself. The problem arises in that sometimes in a desire to make worship more interesting, we end up making it less accessible to the people, and it becomes more soloistic. It might be even enjoyable to listen to or edifying to listen to, but it becomes less and less possible to actually participate with the music. And such is the case as we continue to progress through the Middle Ages. So not only do you have this issue of language, that all the worship is in Latin, you also have the issue that the music is becoming more and more inaccessible for the people to participate with. Now, another reason the music is becoming more interesting has to do with the conception of Christ as the Word. Now, as evangelicals, we understand that when we refer to the Word of God, in one sense, we would mean the Bible before us, that's in English, that we can use for private devotion, that we can take to corporate worship, and that is very much accessible to us. But remember, in the Middle Ages, that unless you were a priest who had access to these writings, and in the West, you're reading the Bible in Latin, you don't have access to Scripture in that way. So your access, if you're an average person, is through the liturgy. And among the leaders, among the theologians, there is this idea connected to our other understanding of word in the New Testament, which is, of course, Christ, as John 1 points to Christ as the Logos, as the Word. They were quite aware of this, but they ended up conflating the two. So whereas we would say as evangelical, all of Scripture, as God's revelation, of course, points us to Christ as a person of the Trinity, they saw the connection such that the very Word of God being proclaimed was Christ to them. And so it was a bit of an overreach, but they were very sincere in this. And in seeing the Word proclaimed as being Christ Himself, they felt an obligation to glorify Christ, to worship Him in various ways. Now, you might recall earlier we talked about some of the earliest Christian art had a similar concept where at the beginning of a gospel you would decorate the cover page to that gospel, like the Gospel of Matthew, and that was seen as decorating Christ. Well, it's the same concept. It's the same theological concept that crosses over into art that we see playing out in this era. Now, the way this would work musically is you would have portions of the service where a psalm would be sung. And in fact, from earlier points in the Middle Ages, there were pretty consistent formulas for how these psalms would be sung. They were called psalm tones. And the way these psalms were sung was actually rather accessible. But what happened over time is they're seeking to, again, worship Christ, glorify Christ, adorn Christ, which they see as the word proclaimed, is they begin adding things to these psalm tones. And these additions eventually come to be known as tropes or troping. So what you would do, for example, on a given Sunday, is the psalm is sung, the psalm chosen for that day, but then we might add words. Now, what words would we add? Well, the words we add might be, or very likely would be, connected to the liturgical calendar. Is there a martyr of the church, a saint of the church, an apostle that we're honoring that day. Well, there could be extra words added about that particular figure. Well, troping could be added words, which would require, which would tend to require notes as well, although those words could be added on a single tone. Today we're honoring the Apostle John. So it could be that simple, but increasingly you could imagine, again, artists like to do things in an interesting way. There's going to be added notes as well, so that the pitches change as well as the words. And this continues on and on, particularly in the region of France, because as we've mentioned, France has kind of now risen up as a dominant hegemonic influence in Europe, in Western Europe, which means they're also going to be a dominant hegemonic influence in worship. So it rises to the point that we're now adding extra parts. And that brings us to a particular location in France, where I like to tell students that the Passion Conference, by the time we get to, let's say, around 1100, 1200, is now at Notre Dame. We talked about the Passion Conference being at Constantinople for good reason, because Constantine had made that the center of the Roman Empire. It continued to be a center place of worship ideas, as we've already discussed. But now, by the time you get to around 1100, 1200, very much also related to a decline of influence from Constantinople, which we'll talk a bit more about a bit more later in the lecture. But now Notre Dame is where the Passion Conference is held, if you will. So at Notre Dame, this troping is becoming more and more interesting. And we have a couple of figures that rise out of this who actually are the first composers to give us a robust 3-part and 4-part singing. Now, when you get into 4-part singing, you're talking about something that has never occurred in human history. So I do want to take a moment to just recognize that this is an extraordinary development that has never been seen by any culture when we get to this 4-part singing. But I also want you to see that this is birthed out of the church, and that it's birthed out of this sincere desire to honor Christ, to worship Him. Now, we would have some caution here, because we understand the music is becoming so inaccessible that the congregation is no longer connected. They're not able to sing along. So it is problematic, but we can recognize at the same time that this interesting music that's developing is both problematic from a congregational participation standpoint, but from the standpoint of beautiful worship art that speaks to the human soul at a deep level. It's a wonderful thing. And this is not going to be the first time we see this in worship history. There are going to be these moments where things become more and more interesting, less accessible, but still powerful for the congregation. I would even suggest to you that we're living through that in our own era, and we'll talk more about that later as well. Well, the two figures that I want you to be aware of in relationship to this movement are Leonin and Periton. They are two church composers. That would not have been the only thing they would have done, but they were involved, very involved in the music at Notre Dame. And what's interesting about these fellows, and you'll see on the PowerPoint, or as you see on the PowerPoint, these guys define humility. And here's what I mean by this. We would not even know their names if it had not been for an English church scholar at a later period of time in the Middle Ages who was doing some research. He was at Notre Dame, he was doing some research, and he came to discover these two gentlemen who really paved the way into this more complex 3-part and 4-part singing, which is called triplume and quadruplume. So they did not refer to themselves. They referred to themselves as anonymous. So, for example, Anonymous 4. And he discovered there was a consistency there, and he was able to align it with this time frame and figured out it was these two individuals. Well, Notre Dame continues to be a high point of worship art. And there are links. Now, during these video lectures, we're not going to take the time to go to these links, but I would encourage you. You could do your own search with the names that you see on the PowerPoint. I think you'll find some of this music very interesting. You might even find it soothing to go to sleep to. I probably should warn you that if I was choosing middle-age worship music to go to sleep to, I probably would pick a little bit earlier time frame than this, because the chant in and of itself is very interesting, very beautiful, very soothing, if you will. At this point, things are getting so interesting with this idea of Notre Dame rocks. It sounds a little strange to our ears. And the truth is, we don't have recordings. We're really doing our best to try to replicate what we think it would have sounded like. The notation is very rudimentary, doesn't look like our notation today. So some of this music at this point in time is a little hard for us to grasp, but I still think you'll find it interesting. Now, as time continues on, as we're racing toward this next era, which is going to be Renaissance, we have some other important composers from this part of the world, or at least associated with the French influence. One of these is Machaut. Now, Machaut, perhaps on a personal interaction, Machaut might have come across as humble, but at least in terms of his desire to connect his name to his writing, there is not the desire to be anonymous like Leonin and Periton. In fact, he's quite intentional in signing his name to his pieces. One thing when we're talking to music students that we always highlight with Machaut is that he wrote the first seamless Mass of the ordinary of the Mass. So just a reminder, the ordinary of the Mass is the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, Sanctus Benedictus, Agnus Dei. Well, he writes a seamless musical presentation of those ordinary sections of the Mass. And that also sort of represents that the most interesting music in the Mass is going to begin to flow increasingly toward the ordinary of the Mass. Whereas before this, the most interesting parts were the proper parts of the Mass, which is where the words change from week to week or change from service to service. Now, you'll still see composers writing for that proper part of the Mass that changes from week to week, but increasingly over time, the most interesting choral worship music is going to come from the ordinary, and Machaut represents that in many ways with his Missa Notre Dame, which is this Mass that has this seamless unfolding of the ordinary of the Mass. We also have Ockeghem, who writes in a very complex canonic style. Now, canon is an interesting word in church history because it means in its most literal sense law or rule. But in music, we think of a canon as being a round. A canon is a type of round. Well, again, as music is becoming more and more interesting, more and more complicated, composers would apply increasingly complex rules for music to be done in a way that was sort of like a round. Now, the reason I say sort of like a round is because some of these rules became quite complicated. For example, in a round as we think of, you have one part start on the melody, and then another part starts at a very clear designated time frame after the first melody, and they're starting on the same pitch. Well, they would have rules that would allow for something like that to occur, but another part could also come in at a different pitch level. Another part could come in and sing, and this might be a basic chant melody, but another part could come in and sing the basic chant melody at twice the length of the original, so all the notes are doubled. And these composers, the musicians, church musicians of this day, they could read these codes and see a single line of melody, and they could apply these rules. It's really extraordinary music ability. We believe that even certain aristocracy for entertainment would sometimes get involved in this type singing. But Ogham uses this idea in church writing and writes very complex canons. Again, just illustrations of very interesting worship writing. Now, I include Dunstable. I happen to be someone of English descent, so I look for opportunities to give the English some credit here in the history of worship. To be honest, it's not a ton of credit. That they do, at certain points, begin to do some new and interesting things. Maybe that's because of their location. They're a little bit remote from the rest of Europe. Honestly, at this time, we just have to say that France is the clearest, most consistent geopolitical force, which is going to make them the major influencer with worship art. But if you've studied this part of history, you know that England is not far behind. In fact, you have these classic battles between England and France, and there's this area really north of what we think of France today, an area referred to as Burgundy or Franco-Flemish territory. And that area could sometimes come under English control, depending on how the English were doing in these ongoing battles with France. Well, there was such a period of time, and there's a composer from England named Dunstable who's doing his own experimentation. Now, he is experimenting with harmony of thirds. We actually call this in music tertian harmony. It's just basic harmony of thirds. Now, we don't know where he came up with this from. In fact, there's a theory that says it might have been just from listening to folk music. And as he heard the thirds, the tertian harmony in folk music, he starts applying it to church music. And he did it in sort of a strange way. Instead of, I'm getting into a little bit of music. I promise you don't need to know this for a test, but for those who know a little bit about music, this might be interesting to you. We typically would think of a third being a harmony above the melodies. So if the melody's here, the harmony's there. It's a third above. But this actually went a sixth below, which also creates a third because of an interval relationship, because that sixth below can flip in terms of its meaning harmonically, it can flip to a third above. And that's called Fallborden. And this is this technique that he's using. Well, the interesting thing about this is because of the geopolitical setting, and this is a classic example. Remember, I started these worship history lectures by saying that we have geopolitical circumstances, we have hegemonic influences, and then we're trying to see how does worship history grow out of that, many times in response to that. And this is a classic example of that, where because of England's influence, and at this period of time, winning some battles, they become more involved in those courts north of France, area of Burgundy, Franco-Flemish territory. They become more involved in that area, and because of court exchange during this time frame, Dunstable's ideas eventually end up in the hands of the French, which is important because they, again, are the dominant hegemonic influence in terms of worship art. So for example, Dunstable's ideas end up in the hands of a late Middle Age composer. Some people would almost even put him as early Renaissance Dufay. And he takes this harmony of thirds, and the rest is history, as we say. Now, I find this kind of comical in a way, because one thing we would certainly say that the English contribute by the time you get to the 20th century is they have a big hand in defining rock and roll. Well, guess what? You cannot have rock and roll without harmony of thirds. So this is really where harmony of thirds starts. It's not going to be long after this before you will actually have composers and musicians who are playing on a lute, that looks like an ancient guitar. They're playing these harmony of thirds. They're singing melodies over them. So you're not as far as you might think in the Middle Ages from rock ballads and that sort of thing. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is how the visual art of this era also captures important theological ideas. So I want to remind you of something, that in the Middle Ages, there is a reconciliation. There is a desired reconciliation of philosophy with Christianity. That's not a new thing as we get to the late Middle Ages. It's an ongoing idea. But what is new in a sense is that some of the early philosophers that the church might have recognized as being important are increasingly forgotten, and increasingly there's a focus on Plato. So increasingly, Plato is reconciled with Christian thought. And part of that, again, is just because some of these other philosophers like Aristotle is forgotten. We're going to talk more about that later. But Plato is very much emphasized and reconciled with Christian thought. Now, what that tends to do is create an ideal that we're looking for in our worship. Like we're looking for a truth that is coming to us from above, that descends to us. We're not really supposed to be enjoying the worship art. You might recall that from our time in talking about Augustine, that worship art's not something to be enjoyed. It's this greater transcendent truth that overwhelms us. So this idea of looking for this truth from above, of this idea that we're not really supposed to enjoy life. And yes, we have to admit, for the corrupt church leaders, we're not saying all church leaders were corrupt at this time, but for those that were corrupt, for aristocracy that are impressing the people, this works out rather nicely. Because if you're a peasant, then, theologically, what you're told is you're not supposed to be enjoying life. You've got this afterlife to look forward to. Now, never mind the fact that aristocracy and much of the church officials are very much enjoying the food and wine and finer things of life. They're preaching to the average people, well, you're not supposed to enjoy life. And then the worship supported this idea. So there's two or three things going on here. Something that's practical for the leaders and serves their purposes, but also a genuine outgrowth of this combination of theology and philosophy. And so what we see with the worship art, I would suggest to you, is an art that's pointing to that which is above. Now, I like to call this disembodied. I like to call this disembodied worship art. And that kind of represents this idea of Plato's influence on this art. Now, we're looking here at a piece of art by Cimabue. And he comes quite late in the Middle Ages, quite late. But you can still see in this art, if I showed you earlier pieces, you might see it even more clearly, but you can still see in this art that Mary, and this is, by the way, a classic painting of Madonna and Child. And so you can see in this art that Mary looks sort of divine. Now, some of that would come out of the Mary cult and worshiping Mary, but it also has to do with this idea I'm presenting of this, all of the art is pointing upward. So even her face, her body, she sort of looks, she doesn't look human, she looks divine. And everything about the picture is pointing upward. It's transcendent. It looks very much divine. Now, within just a few years, just a few decades, not centuries, of this art that you're seeing, we have Giotto who creates an art that is much more realistic in his nature. Okay, now, this art is, at least in my view, it seems pretty clear from looking at the picture, revealing Mary in this painting of Madonna and Child as much more human. She looks human. Our temptation in the arts is to try to explain this just based on the technology of oil painting, because that will be a big part of the explosion of Renaissance, which we're just about to go into Renaissance. But that actually doesn't explain what's going on in these two paintings, because in these two paintings, the technology is the same. No, something else is happening here. There is a philosophical shift that is happening. The art is becoming less disembodied. Mary and Jesus look more human. I would suggest to you, and I want you to connect this to Unit 1, that the worship art is looking more incarnational. It's more balanced. We can, in our desire, because there was, beyond just that practical desire of telling the peasants that, they might as well forget about enjoying life, there was this sincere idea that they were trying to give people this pure worship. But what we can have with pure worship, what can end up happening, is we can end up in puritanical worship, but we can also end up in disembodied worship. And that combination of Plato with the artistic ideas absolutely led to disembodied worship. Whereas this other painting by Giotto shows a much more realistic art, more balanced, if you will, more incarnational, if you will. Now, what I do want to be careful to say is that I'm not suggesting that those who created the disembodied art are so far gone into Platonism that they are Gnostic. I mean, certainly that had been true, and I'm no doubt it was an ongoing issue, and one could easily move into that. But I'm not accusing the church leaders or artists of this time of going so far into Platonism that actually becomes Gnosticism. But rather, the point is that we can easily get unbalanced in our desire to either have pure worship, or we're going to see at various times our desire to make worship art be more realistic or more accessible. In fact, it's not long after this art that some of the Madonna and Child paintings are they're rather disturbing, if you ask me. They're trying so hard to make Mary look realistic that it goes beyond any sense, or at least perceived sense, of trying to keep the purity of the picture that's being presented. Now, as we continue to race toward the end of the Middle Ages, we're going to take a look at some other worship art that represents the theology of the church at this time, but also gives us a picture of the geopolitical circumstances and how worship art can actually show us something about the ways the church would use worship art to influence the people. So this painting that you're looking at comes from a late period in the Middle Ages. We're just about to be looking at Renaissance. It's some of the Renaissance art. And this is a painting by Cimabue. And we think he died around 1300. So just to place that historically, Renaissance will begin in 1400. So we're getting close here. And what I want you to notice about this painting, first of all, this is a very classic setting that is painted over and over throughout the history of the Christian church. This is Madonna and Child. This is Mary holding baby Jesus. And you do see other figures, angelic figures. You see at the bottom, you see gospel writers paying homage. here to Christ. So there's a lot of meaning in this painting. But there's something I want you to notice that you might not immediately pick up on. And this is the reality that Mary does not look particularly human. So we want to ask ourselves, why is that the case? Now, an argument that might come to mind is that the painters from this time just lacked the technical ability to make someone look realistic. Well, that's problematic because there's some very early Christian art where some of the figures look more realistic. So yes, it's possible some of those skills were lost in this time period that's sometimes called the Dark Ages. But I would suggest to you that it's more complicated than that. Another associated argument might be, well, when we get into the Renaissance, we have this new invention for painting called oil painting. And that's what allowed the paintings to look more and more realistic. And there is no question that oil painting opens up the possibilities of how realistic one can make the scene that they're portraying or the person they're portraying. Okay, that's certainly true. But again, there are some reasons why, some good reasons why we would say that doesn't totally explain what's happening. What I would suggest to you is that Cimabue is coming from the end of an era where Platonic thinking is combined with the theology. Now, I want to remind you, we've brought up philosophers already and how philosophic ideas get combined with Christian ideas really rather early, very early in church history. But this is lingering on. This is lingering on. But at this point in time, and not surprisingly, we have church fathers such as Augustine who emphasize Plato. So not surprisingly, at this point in time, Plato is the dominant philosopher who continues to influence the church. So much so that some other philosophers, we're going to learn about this in our next major time period, Renaissance and influence of humanism, some other major philosophers had actually been forgotten by the church. But at this time, Plato is still very important. And I would suggest to you that the theology that the church had landed on was so influenced by this Platonic thinking. And we would give a lot of credit to Augustine here as well because of the way that he also reconciled Plato. And then he continued to influence the church very strongly in their theology, the Western church in particular, that there is a strong influence on Platonism, which is going to be an ideal truth, a truth from above. Now, I want to readily admit to you that at first glance, this is not a problem necessarily, because starting a conversation about God by saying there is this truth beyond what we see, this truth that comes to us from above, that actually sounds like the way you might start an apologetic conversation. So this is not all bad. The problem is there was such an desire and such an inclination towards seeing this ideal truth shower down upon us from the heavens that there is a lack of recognizing the truth before us, what we'll later call a truth from below, which can relate to the beauty of nature or the enjoyment of human life. Now, this brings us to another reason why these ideas might have continued to be propagated for as long as they were. You could imagine that the aristocracy, the power holders at this time, and many of the church officials, and these folks are generally related to one another for the most part, particularly those in very high positions. You could imagine why they would want the average person, the peasant, to think that life is not to be enjoyed. Because if they're reminded in the worship liturgy every week as they come into worship that, well, you're not supposed to be enjoying this life that you're living on earth. All of this hard work you're doing and the taxes you pay and giving to the church, all of this is going to be rewarded to you in heaven. Well, that works out quite well for the power brokers to continue that idea. Meanwhile, the aristocracy, at least some portion of the clergy, are enjoying food and wine and the finer things of life while they're preaching this message. Well, both of these things are going on. But I do want to be clear in saying that this was a sincere idea as well. One reason we know that is that Augustine, we had that reference to Augustine, who said, I feel guilty for enjoying the music in church. And this was several hundred years before this late Middle Age time period. So we know this has been going on for some time, where Augustine is sincerely wrestling with, is it okay for me to enjoy the worship art around me? So again, consistently, this is pointing us to a worship art that is supposed to be pointing us upward. Now, what I would suggest to you is happening here, and I brought up this concept in Unit 1 in relationship to the extremes we can end up going to. What I would suggest to you is happening here is disembodied art. So the way we get at disembodied art is, I think the starting point is good. It's a sincere starting point, a desire for purity in worship. We want this pure worship. Certainly, if you don't want to recognize that as much by 1300, please see it in Augustine. Please see that Augustine has this sincere desire for a pure worship. The problem begins with, as we have this sincere desire, especially if that gets mixed in with some Platonism, we end up creating an art that is actually disembodied. It doesn't have the connection to that which is human. And I would suggest to you, if you looked at some earlier Madonna and Childs, feel free to do that from, let's just say, up to 1300, you're going to see some paintings of Madonna and Child where she looks even more divine, less earthly connected. Now, one other thing I would say about that, some of you might be thinking, well, doesn't this have to do with the cult of Mary and worshiping Mary? Yes, I'll grant you that. I think that's part of why Mary is cast as divine. But now let's look at another painting that contrasts Chemembue, and with this first artist dying around 1300. The next artist dies just a few decades later, around 1330. You want to think of Giotto, who is our next painter. So this is not very long after the previous painting you just saw. So what you're seeing here sort of dismisses these other arguments, that this is not about a change in oil painting. This is not, there wasn't some sudden realization of how to paint figures in a realistic way. No, what I'm suggesting to you is happening at this point in time is there is an awakening to art that portrays these biblical figures in more realistic ways. They look more human. And I would suggest to you a balance is beginning to happen. We're beginning to see a balancing out of recognition of beauty from creation, human beauty, worship beauty. And this is going to go hand in hand. Please keep this painting you're seeing in the back of your mind when we get to our next section where we're talking about the rise of humanism going into the Renaissance. Because some of the ideas that are associated with the rise of humanism are going to help you understand how we ended up with this more balanced art. So just notice here with this Madonna and Child that you're looking at, Does Mary not look more human here? Does Jesus not look more human here? So I would suggest to you, back to that concept from Unit 1, that this art is more incarnational. It's more balanced. I have no reason to believe that Giotto was any less concerned about purity in worship, and yet the worship art that he creates here is more balanced. It's less disembodied. Now, one other warning I want to give regarding this contrast here is that I'm not saying that the Madonna and Child figures up to this point were so Platonistic that they were Gnostic. You certainly, those of you who've studied church history know that if you chase that Platonism idea far enough, you're eventually going to end up with a Christ who's not actually human. I am not suggesting, I'm sure we'd find some artists along the way who painted a Madonna and Child who had Gnostic views, but I'm not suggesting that the vast predominance of these artists or church leaders who are associated with this art would have allowed for a Christ who is anything less than fully divine and fully human. Rather, I'm pointing out that you could have the right theological view of Jesus, but if certain other ideas get mixed in, you can easily end up with a worship art that appears to be out of balance, a worship art that in some ways begins to diminish the full reality of who Christ is. And I think this is one of these points in human history where this occurs. Now, I also want you to think about this idea of disembodied art, of how we can sometimes repeat this and have repeated it at various points in history. Because it's a visual here, it's perhaps the best place to actually see it. But think about this concept of disembodied art, or the other extreme I talked about in Unit 1 is puritanical art. And this reminds us that we need to be in prayer, asking the Lord to protect us from such extremes, allowing us to have truly incarnational art and worship art that the congregation can participate in, that is accessible to them, that exalts Christ. Of course, the starting point is to desire biblically sound, pure worship. But as we begin to take cultural considerations into mind, that those ideas would be balanced in a way that would not compromise the purity of worship, but would be accessible for folks.